This is video 28 of 101. This video is about grains. I found a new love for grains now that I've researched behind what truly makes a grain healthy versus unhealthy. And when you start to utilize the healthy grains, I've found so much more abundant energy in my body. In this video, I'm going to talk about the varieties of grains that you can find in a grocery store, a little bit about gluten and what's really the scare, and just some varieties of how you can incorporate grains into your daily life. There are so many types of grains out there, and this video, again, is only going to be able to scratch the surface. When you go to the grocery store, there are usually two types of grains that you can buy, either the raw unprocessed or the processed version. And being processed or unprocessed isn't what's going to make them unhealthy or healthy, it's just the varieties that you're going to find. So the unprocessed grains that you'll find is things like oat and quinoa and millet and rice. Grains that you'll find that are processed are things like flour or even baked into breads or processed into pastas. So how do we determine which ones are good and which ones are bad? Because the influence of commercial baking and commercial grain processing has definitely left us in the dark about what's actually good for us, because we see these beautiful breads that are all white and pure, and we see all these commercials on TV about them as well, but that doesn't really tell us a whole lot. So let's get down to the basics. Let's talk about wheat for a second here. Wheat is a grain that gets processed into a flour, which then can be baked into a bread. That small grain, if you started to just chew on it, it's not really going to do a whole lot for you because it's very hard for the body to break it down. What needs to happen to that grain is for it to get processed into a flour. That's essentially just a grinding of the grain to process it into what a flour is that we know today. That processing unlocks all of the nutrients that are in that grain, the proteins, the minerals, the carbohydrates. It's all locked up tight in there, and we need to process it into a flour to make it digestible for our bodies. Then, once it's become a flour, we then mix it with water. The process of making bread is actually incredibly simple. It does require a little bit of practice, but straightforward. It's literally flour and water. And so when you combine water into flour, you are going to then activate a protein that's going to develop, and that's called gluten. And gluten is that sticky stuff that starts to develop when you're combining this flour and water. When the bread is baked, it releases carbon dioxide, and that is what rises the bread. But the gluten is this sticky substance that is going to keep those bubbles in the bread and help with the rising process. Everyone is terrified of gluten. And I don't know how it started. We said 10 years ago that fat was the devil, now gluten is the devil, and everyone and their mother are going gluten-free. Let's talk about gluten-free. Is it legit? Is it actually going to help you lose weight or whatever your goals are? Having a gluten intolerance is actually something that 1 or 2% of the population suffers from. And it's not called a gluten intolerance, it's called celiac disease. And your body isn't able to process gluten normally. And now these celiac people are probably in heaven right now because of the whole gluten-free craze, and now they're getting all these foods gluten-free that they've never had before, so I'm sure that they are really, really happy. But for the rest of the population, gluten isn't something that we need to be concerned about. Gluten at its core is not unhealthy, but the way that we have processed bread today, ingredients and the gluten in there may be what's causing that. So let's compare bread making to how it is today. Once that flour and water mixture has been created, a natural fermentation process is meant to happen. And that fermentation process is when literally the flour and the water sit there and bacteria from the air gets in and gets fermented in this bread. That fermentation process is actually going to be breaking down the carbohydrates and the gluten in the bread to make them even more digestible from our bodies. This natural starter is very key to a healthy bread. However, natural starters, they take a little bit more time and they can be a little finicky. So for commercial bread producing, they've come out with commercial yeast. And this commercial yeast doesn't allow that fermentation process to happen. It's just focused on getting the highest rise in the fastest amount of time. And this has left that gluten and those carbohydrates to not be broken down properly. And then in our bodies, we experience various gastrointestinal issues that we are now blaming gluten for. Gluten is not bad. It's just this gummy substance that's helping bread to rise. There's lots of proteins and nutrients in gluten, and it shouldn't be something you're scared of. So what I recommend is searching for these breads that have these natural starters. And so very first thing when you are looking at breads is to read the ingredient lists, and breads literally only need flour and water. And so it doesn't have to mean that there's nothing else in that bread, because There are some breads that I enjoy that have maybe some, flaxseed or rosemary, or a little bit of other flours. And so it doesn't have to be just flour and water, but essentially you don't want to have anything else that you wouldn't recognize. In some typical commercial breads these days, there are an average of like 21 ingredients. Where are all those ingredients coming from? We only need flour and water. What is all this other stuff? For an example of what bread should look like, and I have actually pulled this up in one of my previous videos. So after I watched the Michael Pollan documentary about air and this fermentation process of bread, I tried to do my own natural starter, which didn't work out as well because I wasn't properly educated in how to do it. But then when I was at the grocery store, a small little market actually just off Commercial Drive in Vancouver here, they had natural starter bread, and I was blown away because I never thought I would find this. But here it is, okay? And I've already eaten half of it because it's so incredibly delicious. With typical breads, I would not be able to eat a whole lot of them. I would start to feel kind of like sluggish or slow. Honestly, I could sit here and eat this entire loaf and just feel like bursting of energy. My body doesn't bloat in any way at all, which yeah, I'd used to when I would eat breads before. And I never thought I had a gluten intolerance, but ever since I started eating this bread, oh my god, I've just felt so much better. And the ingredients, unbleached white flour, bran, water, salt, natural sour base, and some seeds like millet, flax, rye, meal, and sunflower. And that's it. And there's so many nutrients: folate, niacin, riboflavin, thiamine, iron, protein, 14 grams of protein, 3 grams of fiber, very little fat. This stuff is legit. And it comes from Westview Bakery in North Van. I would love to go visit them someday, and hopefully I can do a nice vlog about that. But essentially, that's the kind of bread. Like, this bread you're probably not going to find in a typical North American grocery store. However, trying to get as close as possible, or even seeking out a bakery in the surrounding area that does this, just doing a nice Google search, calling up a couple of bakeries, seeing how they do their starter, maybe even educating them about using a natural starter. So that's bread. That's gluten. Gluten is not the devil. Our media loves to make enemies out of food. There's no enemy in bread. When it's naturally done, it's an incredible source of protein, carbohydrates, and minerals. Now, let's talk a little bit about the difference between white flour and whole wheat flour. And whole wheat flour essentially is that the grain has not been stripped of the outer shell, and so that's the whole wheat. And if you can eat whole wheat, I highly recommend it, especially if you're eating any kind of bread without a natural starter in it. Whole wheat is the best place to go because that means that the grain has been the least processed in this commercial production. So then you get into other things like white pastas versus whole wheat pastas. And now I will say, white pastas are obviously delicious, but when that grain has been stripped of all those nutrients, there's not a whole lot there that is going to give you that nutrient. So obviously we try to recommend the whole wheat. Now this bread is based in white flour. However, since it's using a natural starter, there's not that big of a risk. Like, there's still a whole lot of nutrients there that the fermentation process is broken down. For pastas, I know that white pasta is delicious and whole wheat pasta is kind of gross. I'm not gonna lie. I'm not a fan of whole wheat pastas. I can eat whole wheat bread, I think it's great, but whole wheat pastas, there's just something really grainy about them. So here is the solution. So what I love to eat is brown rice pasta. And this pasta, even though it's brown rice, it tastes like white pasta. It is delicious, and it's way better for you than any of the grain pastas because the rice that's been used instead. So you're getting those rice nutrients, but also in a nice whole wheat kind of sense without losing that taste there. Highly recommend brown rice pastas. They are delicious. You'll find all of the macaroni, the spaghetti, the linguine, all those different varieties there. Now let's talk about a couple other grains. Quinoa is extremely high in protein and it has a complete amino acid profile. As well, oats can make some really great breakfast options. Overnight oats are delicious. I'm gonna put some links down below and some overnight oat recipes, but essentially what I love to do, if you don't have any time in the morning to make breakfast, something you can do the night before, get a jar, a cup of oats, and then a cup of almond milk or something, add in some chia seeds, add in some maple syrup, maybe a little bit of stevia, and then let it sit overnight, and it's going to make this really nice kind of oaty texture. So I wouldn't recommend filling it all the way up, because then in the morning you can add fresh fruit, you can add berries, maybe a little bit of granola even, just make it so it's like a nice parfait. The night before it takes maybe 2 minutes to set up, and then it takes you a minute to grab it, open it, and add in your other stuff, and then you've got a nice delicious breakfast right there. And lastly, the great thing about grains is that they are extremely easy to cook. Just take your ratio of 1 cup of grains to 2 cups of water, may vary depending on the kind of grain. Essentially, you then just add that into a pot, cook it up, and you've got some extra grains. Cooking up grains, which is super simple, takes your 1 recipe into a full meal. Grains are pretty amazing. Legumes also fall under the category of grains, and I'm going to be doing a video about that tomorrow. But essentially, keeping that grain whole, keeping that process as minimal as possible will ensure that you are going to be getting the most nutrients out of your grains. So read over the ingredients, become an informed consumer about the kind of bread you're eating. Don't be scared by gluten. Do your research. There's an incredible documentary that I'm going to link down below. I think the natural fermentation process of bread is incredible, and to me I think that's kind of magical. The fact that flour and water, something that if you were given just flour and water to eat for the rest of your life, you'd eventually die. But if then you take that flour and water and combine it into something, you could live off that for the rest of your life. I think that's pretty magical.